Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, ready for everyday liberties, current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis and ready for everyday liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. December 16 is an important day on Kazakhstan's calendar. This is when Kazakhstan declared its independence, but this is also a day when people mourn the death of their loved ones who were killed in government crackdown against striking oil workers in the town of Zhanaozen. Our Kazakh service journalist Peter Trotsenko, who toured Zhanaozen on December 16, says that the city was as if frozen, gloomy, and deserted. Police were everywhere, especially in the central square where 10 years ago striking oil workers were hit and many died. So this is the situation in Zhanaozen. How is this bloody events commemorated in the rest of the country? What the government is doing or saying? 10 years on since the event, what came out of the investigation? So today we will remember Zhanaozen victims and reflect on what happened that day and what happened since. To discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Nurseit Niyazbekov, Assistant Professor of International and Regional Studies at the Kimep University, Yevgeny Zhovtis, the Director of the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law, Darkhan Omerbekov, Senior Journalist with Radio for Everyday Liberties Kazakh Service, locally known Radio Azadtik, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio for Everyday Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlog Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us in this important conversation. So earlier I was kind of describing the dead silence in Zhanaozen through the lenses of our correspondent on the ground. So take us from there, Darkhan. You are on the ground in Nur Sultan. Take us from there. Describe us the atmosphere in Zhanaozen today.
We are hearing from our reporter Peter Trasenka and the other sources of information, and this time in Zhanaozen it's always windy and the storm goes everywhere, so just unlucky time in terms of weather. But we have people who are from Zhanaozen and they say that these days are like a tragic for them, and everyone from Zhanaozen is saying that this is not the holiday, this is not the day they are just celebrating, the day of independence. So this year, nothing has changed. People are just commemorating all those who died during those events. And we've seen from Peter's reporting that they're commemorating events like we call it in Kazakh As, just the traditional ceremony, or just like the events to commemorate those who died. And that's it. That's the environment. Of course, these days, the police takes care of everything. They're in full control of the city and just checking everyone. And our reporters told us that they were followed by the unknown people, and they suspect that they were the KGB guys. The Kazakh security committee.
So when you say, Darkhan, people remember those days, those victims, those tragic events, how should we visualize that? In which way they remember it?
They usually go to the cemetery where those people were buried, pray Quran, and then sometimes they gather in the yards or sometimes in the restaurants and hold some kind of commemorating lunch or something else. But usually by slaughtering sometimes sheep, and the way how the Muslims do when they commemorate.
So, but there is no kind of public event activities going on?
No. The authorities, especially the mayor of the Mangsto region where Zhanaozen is located, weeks ago told us that the government, the local authorities are not going to hold any public events. So the city is empty and quiet these days.
That's a strange day. Your reporter, Peter, also kind of hints into that in his reporting. Like, this is also a day when Kazakhstan declared its independence. Independence celebrations are usually held in Central Asia and elsewhere with large-size activities, public festivities, and things like that. So there is also no independent day-related activities taking place in Zhanaozen, it means.
Yes, correct. And Nur Sultan city was also quiet. And we tried to talk to people on the street, and everyone was telling that this is not the holiday we should celebrate. And this year, I heard from many people that we should change the date for Independence Day to another day, like October 25, when we declared in 1990 our sovereignty. The day was used to be also a holiday until, I guess, 2009 or 7. And then it was eliminated as a holiday. We do not celebrate the Republic Day anymore. And some people were just suggesting that we should start using that day to celebrate the Independence Day. And December 16 cannot be a holiday because of Zhanaozen, because of Желтоқсан events in 1986.
Very interesting. I know, Yevgeny, you have plenty to share on this, given your first-hand accounts, first-hand investigation following those events. So the way Darkhan was describing the atmosphere in Zhanaozen, how is this different when compared to the activities or commemorations might have held in the past, in the previous years on the Zhanaozen events?
I want to reiterate what was already said, that these are 3 days which are very strange, because 16th of December is on one hand the celebration of the independence, the day of independence, and at the same time it's the tragic events in Zhanaozen, followed by the commemoration of tragic events of 17th and 18th of December of 1986, of the Желтоқсан events. That everything is coincided and then practically is linked to each other. Secondly, there were some activities, this in Almaty and some other cities, where the people tried to go out to the streets calling for the commemoration on one hand, for investigation on another. 4 human rights organizations 2 days ago issued a statement related to these events. But it looks like there are 3 parts of the society or of the government which are paying attention to what is going on or to all these events. First, it's the civic activists, the political opposition, some human rights defenders, those who were involved in Toksan events or in the following the events in Zhanaozen. They try still to raise the issue. They start to call for the independent international investigation. You know that the UN Human Rights Commissioner calls for this independent commission which could investigate the events. Secondly, there was the calls from the UN Human Rights Council, the calls from the UN Human Rights Committee, the last report on International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights implementation by Kazakhstan. The committee issued the recommendations. Again, one of the key recommendations was about Zhanaozen, but nothing happens. That the people are still calling, human rights organizations are still calling for that, but it's a relatively small part. The bigger part of the society, they are quiet, but especially in the west of the country, they did not forget, for sure. And that's in certain way, it's some kind of quiet commemoration without any clear impression that something is going on. But the people, of course, remember. And finally, the government. That the government tried to keep everything under the control. The Committee on National Security in all cities, together with the police, with the local police, tried to control all civic activists. A lot of people were arrested preventively before going yesterday to the streets, which was altogether about Zhanaozen events, about the political prisoners, about the Желтоқсан events, all together. The government, of course, the most part of the government are the same people who were in power in the time when the events took place, and they don't want to do so. That the reaction is that, okay, we had already investigation, some people were sentenced to imprisonment, including the oil workers on one hand, and some of the police. But in general, 3 key questions were not answered, and I already pointed it out very clearly. First of all, we still didn't know exactly what happened and who were those people who were clearly provocateurs. Secondly, who gave the order to send the armed troops, not the troops which could stop even if mass disorder happens, but the people were not armed. And the police was armed. Who allowed the people to go to the police to go to the streets with the heavy arms? And finally, who exactly individually who made shots? And these questions are still, after 10 years, in the air, after 10 years of these events.
These are Very, very relevant questions. I had a couple of other points with regards to the way those events are commemorated today. But since you raised these issues, Yevgeny, let me also bring in Dr. Niazbekov. So, a couple of very legitimate questions being raised by Yevgeny in terms of the investigations. It's been 10 years. I mean, what's the hurdle? What are some of those elements which kind of obstructs to find the truth and bring it to public?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that we are dealing with a very well-consolidated authoritarian regime. And as any authoritarian regime, its survival depends on hiding the truth, on skewing the reality, on deceiving the public, managing information, and all these information flows. And so this is exactly what the government is trying to do. Had the people found out what actually happened, had there been answers to the questions that Evgeny had raised, the regime would have committed a suicide. But people up there are not fools in order to undermine their legitimacy and to undermine the public trust. So that's actually why they're hiding the truth from the people.
There are two kind of sides of conversation here. One is what actually happened and what has been, over the past 10 years, what has been the official version of what happened. Bruce, do you would like to jump in and kind of separate these two questions?
Well, I mean, as far as what happened, we've laid out, the day of the tragic events and stuff. But I mean, this strike had been going on since I think May of 2011 for many months, and even then there was problem. The government was interfering and putting pressure on not just the striking oil workers, but also on trade union representatives who were trying to help out the striking oil workers and activists too that were also part of it. As I remember it, there was a lot of other people who were supporting the oil workers, and you could see that the government was getting nervous as we got closer and closer to Independence Day at the time. There's a lot of stories about exactly what happened. I mean, officially they say 16 people were killed, but a lot of people say it was many, many more than that. And that, there was 2 or 3 days of just terror in the area in Zhanaozen and the area around Zhanaozen, with security forces running all over the place, trying to catch people and shooting at them in cases. Since then, too, well, there's many problems that have happened since then. I mean, you could point out, one, the investigation was clearly not very thoroughly done. They found some scapegoats. They said that these were the guys that were guilty. They received some punishment, not a lot. Certainly, considering the gravity of the violence that happened that day, it's amazing that some of these people, they got a few policemen and the local head of the police force, I think, and they got the equivalent of like slaps on the wrist or something. I mean, they did have to go to jail for a while, but not for very long, not considering how many people were killed, even officially. And then since then, of course, they've just wrecked the independent trade unions in the country, because they look at them as being part of the problem, as having, helped fuel the tensions out there, probably a bad term to use with oil workers. So since then, the government has methodically undercut any possibility of a repeat of this by making sure that, like I said, independent trade unions were either not registered or certainly didn't have much power. There was a lot of labor strikes this year, for instance, and they seemed to work to defuse, especially the strike. Most of them involved the oil industry too, and they did what they could to defuse that by giving their classic tactic of giving the or the striking workers some of what they wanted in the hopes that they would stop. But you could see that also was making the government nervous, going as we approached the December 16th. They had more than 10 strikes going on in Zhanaozen alone during parts of this last summer. And it seemed to be spreading like the last one did to other areas in Mangistau province and other areas. So, it's had a big effect on the country. It's a black stain that no one wants to try to open up and really get to the, at least no one in the government wants to see reinvestigated or looked at again.
No, these are very important points that, Bruce, you are raising in terms of what it led to in terms of more protests elsewhere in the country. But one final thought about the government response in this moment. Have you ever heard anything President Tokayev say about this specific event? If he did, what kind of word exactly he used to describe it?
I'm going to leave that for our other guests. He must have addressed it at some time or another. But this is a subject that even when it comes up, officials don't want to give more than 1 or 2 sentences to. But like I said, probably any of our other guests would have noticed if that happened.
Anyone else who might recall how President Tokayev, or maybe Nazarbayev in that case, describe this event? If they did, how they did it? What kind of specific terms that they used to describe it?
As a successor,
I cannot recall anything.
Darkhan, you said you don't recall anything. Okay, anyone else?
First of all, I want to add something what Bruce said, that besides cracking down
just recently we've seen Nazarbayev's interview with Oliver Stone, where ex-president mentioned Zhanaozen events. He reiterated his previous statements, blaming Mukhtar Ablyazov on organizing those events and pretending that the government was innocent and didn't kill oil workers. And I cannot recall anything specific from President Tokayev, but even if he said in the past something related to Zhanaozen, he could say something that could contradict the Agorta's point on that issue.
The official.
But President Tokayev today tweeted about December events in 1986, saying that the Kazakh young people protested against the communist power, and it was the sign that the Kazakhs wanted independence and etc. It coincides with the patriotic explanation of those events in school books and the official explanation of those events. But there are many issues regarding even December events as well, and we don't have answers to them as well.
That's very, very interesting. Like you earlier mentioned, the only kind of reflection about those December 16 Zhanaozen events came from former President Nazarbayev, in which he blamed on Ablyazov for organizing those protests and said that government has nothing to explain. In the meantime, the minimal action that we have seen so far by the Kazakh authorities, as earlier Yevgeny said, some police officers were also jailed. So on one hand, Nazarbayev is saying that there is nothing government to be blamed about. In the meantime, they are jailing their own security forces. Very, very strange reaction. I mean, why this becomes so sensitive issue? Yevgeny, earlier you wanted to say something.
Yes.
Can you respond into this question?
Yes.
Why it becomes so sensitive for authorities?
First of all, I want to reiterate what Bruce said, and that's something that besides cracking down on trade unions, these events were used to crack down on the opposition. And practically the DCK or Alga party was banned after the events. Then there was the crackdown on independent media, the informational consortium of Respublika and so on, that it was used there were political gains of the events to crack down on the opposition. And for 10 years, we are witnessing the same situation, that Tokayev is now following Nazarbayev in cracking down on civic activists, not allowing opposition or political parties to register, and not allowing to independent media to exist, really, national-wide media at least. I want to add that Tokayev didn't say anything about the events itself, but in September he went to the region and he ordered to create this special, some kind of headquarters on resolution of the labor conflicts. He tried in certain way to address certain issues. And of course, it's very difficult to do if you are cracking down on independent trade unions and there are no representatives of workers in reality. But when this situation is very sensitive, it's the same. It reminds me, of course, not to such scale, the events in Andijan in Uzbekistan. Because on the international arena, it looks very bad. You are cracking down, you are shooting your own workers, which were unarmed. It was clear. And secondly, a lot of people who were involved, including Mr. Nazarbayev himself, including former Minister of Interior, including a number of people, of course, they don't want to blame themselves. I absolutely agree with the North that it is an authoritarian regime. Authoritarian regime is never recognizing or acknowledging that it makes mistakes. It's obviously are trying to point to other actors saying that, okay, the oil workers are to be blamed themselves, or political opposition, or Ablazov, or DCK, or Alga, and so on. That is, in general, they don't want to disclose that because it's clear that starting from the beginning, they don't want to solve the conflict in a normal matter, and then they were using provocateurs, and then they are killing their own people. And it's obvious for them. They don't want to commit suicide in the public eyes. But what I'm sure of, I'm finishing, that in the people's memory, in the people's minds, in the people's perception, everything is fresh. And the people are still looking at this situation. It's very, very controversial. When on one hand you are celebrating the independence, and on the other hand you have these tragic events in the west of the country.
Right. Yeah.
And I'd like to add one point.
Quickly, please, Darkhan. We need to move on. Yeah.
Just many people in Kazakhstan are convinced that the order came from Nazarbayev himself, because we are the country where everything depends on the president. President Nazarbayev created such a system where only him can make these kind of decisions, and the local authorities are known to try to avoid taking responsibility for important decisions. They always try to do things but in the name of Nazarbayev, and people say that it's highly unlikely that the government could afford ordering to fire at unarmed oil workers, and they don't believe that it could be done by the Minister of Internal Affairs as well. And even if the authorities try to give some kind of explanation, that would sound implausible, and the government would need serious evidence. And as Nursid and Evgeny told, they cannot do that.
Right. Terrific. Thank you very much, colleagues. It was very insightful. So, going forward, it was indeed a major incident in history of Kazakhstan, and they are still struggling how to deal with the legacy of it. So, what has been the implications? Earlier, Yevgeny kind of pointed out on some of those implications, the legacy of those events. Earlier, Bruce was talking about what happened to trade unions. Also, my kind of additional question in the same context is, did anything change in the circumstances in which those oil workers decided to strike in the first place? Let's continue the conversation talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Nursid Niyazbekov, Assistant Professor of International and Regional Studies at the KMEP University, Yevgeny Zhotis, the Director of the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law, Darkhan Omirbekov, Senior Journalist with Radio for Free Liberties Kazakh Service, locally known as Radio Azadlik, and Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio for Free Liberties Central Asia blog Kishlak Owazi. Bruce is joining us from Prague, and our other guests are all joining us from Kazakhstan today. And I'm Mohammed Tahir, Radio for Free Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis podcast, and I'm here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the Zhanaozen incident and its legacy. So let me start with Dr. Niyazbekov. So the implications. It was, as I said, it was a major event. I guess 16 people were killed and dozens injured. So when you think of what the implications of those events have been, what comes to your mind? And let me also add here earlier what Yevgeny was talking about. Since those events, authorities tend to blame all kind of protest activities to be part of opposition. So that's one of the lessons that authorities drawn from that, and they seem to be using it for their own purpose. So other than that, Dr. Niyazbekov, what comes to your mind in terms of what has been the implications of those events?
In my opinion, the regime was taken by complete surprise. It didn't expect that after almost 8 or 9 months of endless protests, workers, this could be seen by some political opposition movement as an opportunity to come along and to politicize those otherwise perceived as economic demands. Because in the beginning, the protesters were demanding better working conditions, rising salaries and stuff like that. But closer to December, some of the political activists traveled to Zhanaozen to protest along with oil workers. And this is when the oil workers started to demand the resignation of the prime minister. So things started to get really hot. So after the protests were suppressed, What the regime learned from this, what took away from this, is that it should separate as much as possible political protests from economic protests. So it will never, in my opinion, repeat this mistake because it was very costly to the regime. So what will happen now after these events is that if the regime sees that there are single mothers with lots of children, if there are people unhappy with the land reform, if they're unhappy with the import of cars from outside the customs union, I mean, all these economically motivated protests, right? The regime will take immediate steps to address these concerns, to prevent these economic issues and grievances from politicizing. Something that happened during the Zhanaozen event. Today, political protests are minimal and they're all contained and they're very heavily suppressed. They're very heavily and policed. But if you look at the economic protests, this is as long as the single mothers and other economically aggrieved segments of the population do not politicize and approach the political opposition. Should that happen, the regime will take this extremely sensitively and destroy it at the very
yeah. So other than kind of public events, the types of which Dr. Niazbekov has mentioned earlier, what has been the implications of those events that are seen throughout the society, in which ways they are seen? Anything else to be discussed in terms of the implications of those events at this stage? Otherwise, we are going to move on. There are a couple of other points we would like to discuss before we end the conversation. It's open for anyone.
One little thing I would like to add, really short, Muhammad. Another thing that they've improved is communication with the society. So they have boosted their digital presence and they started to react to the public grievances as much as possible through the digital presence.
Terrific point here, Dr. Niazbekov. One area one would have logically expected to see some changes happening as a result of those December 16 events in Zhanaozen is the condition which led to those protests to begin in the first place. I mean, working conditions of those oil workers, the grievances that led to protests resulting in a bloody crackdown against them. So has there been any fundamental change taking place in those conditions? Yevgeny, maybe this question kind of speaks to your background.
Probably I will add two things. First of all, what they learned after these events, another 2 points I want to stress it. First of all, not to allow people to consolidate, even with the economical demands. Not to allow to get big, let's say, so consolidation among different groups, that's why they adopted this law on trade unions, draconian, which is now trying slightly to ease because of the recommendation and criticism of the ILO. But in general, first, what they learn out of that if it will be big groups of people, it could be politicized. Even if they separated the political opposition, that's in certain way big groups, and that's why they are, let's say, so obstructing the work of the independent trade unions. And second, what they learn that they have to establish or to find out the leaders of public opinion or some kind, not formal, but informal leader, that civic activist, which has in the social networks or in other way, the mobilization capacity, some kind of capacity to cooperate people around them, they're trying to crack down on them. That's why all these trials which are underway against different civil activists, the most harsh sentences are, let's say, so imposed on the such kind of leaders or the activists which are more, let's say, so outspoken or more charismatic or something like that. What about the society? Of course, if you have this last 10 years of permanent crackdown on any kind of political activity, including the peaceful assemblies, including the calls for something, pressure in the social networks, this, of course, has a certain impact on the society, that the society understands that it's more and more difficult to express your political views. And of course, what they are doing, they are controlling the elections and all inter-electoral periods in a better way. They created this special Ministry of Information and Social Development. They institutionalizing the control. And this is what, to a certain extent, also the result of these Zhanaozen events in general.
Very interesting what you are saying, Yevgeny. None of what you said the government learned or took away from those events seems to be positive. I mean, it seems that they were more focused on how to find ways to crack down, not on how to address issues, the problems which led to those kind of protests in the first place. Bruce, we kind of wrapping up the conversation today. Is there any final thoughts that you would like to add, or is there anything that we missed to discuss so far that you would like to raise?
Well, I thought you just made a really good point there, is that, that this is the lessons, not just in Kazakhstan. I can't just lay this all on the Kazakh government, but really across Central Asia. The lessons they learned from when things like Zhanaozen happen are the wrong lessons. What they should be figuring out is what were the people demanding and how can they do something to at least partially meet these kind of demands. But instead, they look at this as a failure of security forces to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And that's where they come at these problems from. Not what can we do to keep our people happy, but what can we do to improve security forces so that something like this isn't repeated. And like I said, unfortunately, this is how they work again and again and again. And other countries watch it too. Yeah. They see what happened. Neighboring Central Asian countries see what happens in one country, and they also take steps so that they don't have to go through the same experience by improving their security forces' abilities, adding more people to the security forces, something like that. It's really, really unfortunate that this kind of stuff happens. But we've also heard some good points during this about, what happened with protest and strikes and how they divide them. When you think about the kettling that goes on, or activists and people being picked up ahead of a known demonstration or rally or something like that, that mostly happens, with the political protest. When they have labor strikes, like the oil workers, in this case we've been talking about, they've learned to be much more cautious about how they approach them. What happened in Zhanaozen on December 16, 2011, showed the authority, if nothing else, they recognized, whether they're willing to admit it or not, that they went way over the limit with that one. And so when they see these people going on strike and making demands for better wages, better working conditions, additional benefits and stuff, they address that really quickly. They go out and meet with them. Officials usually meet with them. And like I said, the striking workers never get all of what they want, but they usually get some of what they want. And like I said, the government learned that they can't let these things fester like they did in 2011. Dr. Niazbekov mentioned the strikes that started in 2011 started, 8-9 months before actually Zhanaozen happened. And more services and more, industries joined the strike in some way or another. It was the oil workers, and then it was also the transport workers, for the oil companies and other industries around there that kind of joined in, and so it became a much bigger strike involving many, many different sectors of the western part of Kazakhstan. And so they've gotten better at trying to make sure that this stuff does not go on for very long, so that it can't attract other workers from other industries or other areas in the around the country.
I think I heard someone say, maybe I misheard them earlier, like after those events, authorities started blaming any kind of protest to be a politically motivated. So you are saying that they learned how to distinguish between political rallies and rallies purely organized, let's say, for economic reasons.
Well, to some extent. I mean, Yevgeny made the absolutely valid point that labor strikes have a way, any labor or strike or something has a way of becoming politicized as it goes along. If you let it go for weeks and weeks, the demands for higher wages become the demands for changes in government or officials in the government. So, that's one thing that they, like I said, that the government did learn, is that you can't let these things go on for a long time.
From that
you can't
perspective,
send in the troops to beat people up or, or shoot at them like they did.
Okay. So very final point here. Again, we started this conversation from Zhanaozen events. So let's end it with them. So maybe, Darkhan, this is a question for you. So what happened to the families of those victims? In any way they were compensated, they were heard? What has been sort of legacy for them, for the family members of the victims?
I'm afraid I'm not the right person to ask this question, because I cannot speak for every family. But from our accounts, some of them got the compensation in exchange for silence. I've heard from our reporters who reported from Zhanaozen told us that the people are afraid to talk to journalists because the government gave them compensation, some kind of, and they gave them jobs, like they found them a job. Sometimes, like it might be like good position, sometimes just regular position, but like they fear that they would lose their jobs, their status, if they speak to journalists. That means that when the government was giving this kind of helps or aids to those families, I guess they gave them with the condition to not speak about the Zhanaozen events. Still, like not all the people in Zhanaozen are anxious to talk their grievances because of this, like the fear from the local authorities.
Right.
But there are families who lost not only one member of the family, but two, and there were families that just. There was one person, the orphan, whose name was Bajenka, and he is today a hero for many Zhanaozen people because he was forced to blame the oil workers, but then he admitted that he was forced and that he was lying in order to put those oil workers into jail, but. After that, he was killed in a just very strange situation by two drunken people, but no one believes that drunken people could kill him, and they suspect that this was organized killing.
Wow.
Stories differs from one family to another, I assume.
I think it sums up today's very kind of a tragic conversation. And I also know that, Yevgeny, you have worked on this extensively. If you want to add anything in 2 lines, your microphone is yours. Otherwise, I'm going to end the conversation in terms of the implications, in terms of the legacy of those events into the family members of victims.
Very briefly, 2 lines about the international reaction. And first of all, about the reaction of the European Union, US, and so on. And as I said already, it reminds me the situation with the Andijan events as well. At a certain point, there was some kind of criticism and some kind of, calls for the independent investigation and so on. But finally, it ended up with the zero reaction, and except the UN structures which were calling again for this investigation, nothing happens. Unfortunately, it shows that international community, international institutions, democratic countries are rather weak in their calls and their policy related to such tragic events. And it is, of course, it's made me very, very sad in that regard.
Yeah, it's very good that you raised the international reaction element there, or lack thereof, in terms of these events. Otherwise, we have forgotten that. But thank you very much. It was a very good point. So with this, we unfortunately have to conclude the conversation here. Thank you very much, Yevgeny Zhotisty, Director of the Kazakhstan International Bureau for Human Rights and Rule of Law. Also, big thanks to Dr. Nursaid Niyazbekov, Assistant Professor of International and Regional Studies at the Kemep University, and Darkhan Omerbekov, Senior Journalist with Radio Free Press Liberties Kazakh Service, locally known as Radio Azadtik, along with Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Press Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio Free Press Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. Until next week, bye-bye.